If one is to say that humans have gone through a romantic era, one might, with the utilization of their brain, come to the conclusion that the romantic era has something to do with romance. A feeling or an expression of love that binds two such different souls together, a woman and a man, to become something more than themselves, a family. Or maybe, considering the fact that romance can happen outside of family, one might assume that this era was filled with art that expressed great romantic passion, sensual pleasure, and erotic fantasies. And to tell you the truth, such was I also, a naive human being who fell into the pit of a false presumption that the titles granted to the eras of music, poetry, and art in general represent that with which they are usually associated and affiliated. But wrong! That is not really the case when it comes to the Romantic period. Said period, if one considers it from a literary perspective, has almost nothing to do with romance and love. For the core constituents of the Romantic period's writing revolved around rebellion, liberalism, individualism, subjectivism, nature, and the list goes on. And yes, while there are references to love and romance itself, such concepts were not the primary themes of the Romantic writers of the time. Seeing that this slide does not sufficiently represent the actual themes of the Romantic era, it would be fitting to change this title page. Bam! That's a lot better. Now, to understand why exactly people were fixating so much on rebellion, individualism, emotionality, and nature rather than love and romance, one has to consider the time period. The Romantic era began approximately in 1798. And while some scholars argue that it began at a later year, an overwhelming majority agrees that it began at the beginning of the 18th century as a reaction to two major revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution, which started in 1775 and ended in 1783, was one of the biggest contributing factors to the French Revolution, which literally started the same year as the Romantic era itself, in 1798. Due to these revolutions being successful, a lot of people in Europe realized that change was possible. And so some of them started rebelling through their writings against the notions, systems, and values that had been popular at the time. These writers were especially zealous at going against the industrialistic notions that were contributing to scientific innovation, trying to sway the public from objectivity, rationality, and common sense that were popularized by the Age of Reason and replacing them with such concepts as irrationality, emotionality, and subjectivism. One of these Romantic era writers was Anna Laetitia Barbald. In contrast to what I just said, there were some prominent Romantic writers who advocated for reason, common sense, and logic, and she was one of them. She stated that women ought to be educated because if they were to be educated, things would be a lot better for everyone. Rather than concentrating on themes of emotionality, subjectivism, and irrationality, Anna Laetitia Barbald would integrate themes of suffering, individualism, and political issues in her writing. In most cases, said themes revolved around women and sometimes contained feministic undertones and messaging. A good example of such writing was Anna Laetitia Barbald's poem The Rights of Women, where she calls for women to rise up and assert their rule over men. What grants women the right to do such a thing, according to Anna Laetitia Barbald, are the negative experiences that they have gone through, for they have been scorned, degraded, and oppressed by men. The poem calls for women to rise up and subjugate the men rather than be their friends, conquering, subduing, and restraining men for them to do the women's bidding. She acknowledges, though, that it is almost impossible to achieve said goals and seems to imply that if women are to come into possession of sovereignty over men, they would have to utilize their femininity rather than brute force. Ultimately, Anna Laetitia Barbald strongly implies that while women have the right to rule and that men are abusive and evil, it would be better to be in a positive and loving relationship with men rather than a relationship that is filled with scorn and upheaval. In this way, even though Anna isn't explicitly championing feminism per se, she does acknowledge the rights of women, making the readers of her work more comfortable with the notions that women deserve more rights. That is not to say that she only concentrated on women's issues in her writings. Sometimes she would have other popular romantic themes in her writing, like nature, but the aforementioned themes are mainly what she is remembered for. Arguably one of the most prominent and famous romantic writers was William Wordsworth. And while some scholars argue that William Wordsworth's radical views became more conservative as time passed on, making him a worse example of a classical romantic writer in comparison to others like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, no one really argues that William Wordsworth was one of the greatest writers of his time. William Wordsworth has written a plethora of famous literary texts, including the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, in which he stated that great poetry is expressed through the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions. Considering this statement, you would be right to assume that William Wordsworth concentrated on emotions and feelings a lot more than Anna Laetitia Barbald. He also went out of his way to write in a common language. This means that his writings aren't riddled with copious amounts of fancy and intricate words, but are composed of words that were commonly used by ordinary people. William Wordsworth has also been known to write a lot about nature. In fact, nature is one of the most common themes found in his writing. A great example of a poem from William Wordsworth that exemplifies his fixation on nature is Lucy Gray. This poem is about a girl who goes out into a snowstorm, after which her parents go out to find her, but to no avail, for she is lost forever. The poem itself makes an immense amount of references to nature. It mentions a fawn, a hare, snow, the moon, a mountain row, a hill, etc. In most cases, the goal of William Wordsworth is to direct the reader's attention towards nature so that the reader would truly appreciate its beauty and majesty. It also has to be mentioned that this poem is a great example of common language. My English, sadly, is pretty bad. Still, while reading this poem, I understood every single word, notion, and idea that William Wordsworth was utilizing in this poem, which shows that he really stood by the principles he had outlined for himself to uphold. Also, Lucy Gray is devoid of any abstraction or complicated philosophical notions that were seen as reflective of good poetry back in his day and even by some of our day and age. This, as mentioned previously, allows the common folk to read and enjoy his work, for it is clear, straightforward, and easy to read. The last romantic writer I would like to talk about is one of the later Romantic era poets, whose name is Percy Bysshe Shelley. Rather than concentrating on the beauty and majesty of nature as William Wordsworth would, Percy Bysshe Shelley concentrated more on individualistic themes like Anna Laetitia Barbald, who was mentioned before. While it is argued by some that Percy Bysshe Shelley's style isn't particularly simple, he nonetheless was attempting to reach the majority by covering subjects that were very relatable to the common folk. Percy Bysshe Shelley's writings are commonly political, and considering the times during which he lived, are also quite radical, for he called for drastic social change in his writing, which was meant to encourage people to get rid of tyranny, social inequality, and abuse, which was permeating within his country during that period of time. A good example of Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem that has a political message happens to be England in 1819, where he outlines how monarchy is an inadequate system of government. It is likely that Percy Bysshe Shelley was greatly inspired to write this poem by the unrest that took place in England in 1819. That is because the poor people of England stood up in a peaceful protest against the actions of the government that year, but the government retaliated by attacking these protesters with the military. Now, the poem itself states that the rulers of the people, those being the kings and princes of England, neither see, nor feel, nor know the issues and problems of the people who they are meant to rule. It describes the ruling government of England as leeches that cling to the nation, drinking up and sucking out the resources that the working men produce. The poem also states that this period in England was tempestuous and full of hardship due to the laws being passed by the government, again illuminating the fact that the monarchical system of government in England was abusive, tyrannical, and unjust to those who were under its control. In this way, by outlining the issues present within his country, Percy Bysshe Shelley was making his compatriots more driven to advocate and enact change. While there were a lot more Romantic era writers, these poets were some of the most prominent writers of that period. They wrote about all sorts of topics that revolved around themes such as nature, rebellion, liberalism, individualism, subjectivism, and political change, with a considerable emphasis on the emotions and feelings of human beings. The reason why this era is pivotal and worthy of people's attention is due to the fact that it was the time when people started to think outside of the parameters of conservatism, exploring notions that are commonly associated with liberalism. Ideas like individual freedom and women's rights got a lot more prominent during these days, evolving into social justice and feminism that we see and hear about almost every single day. Finally, I would like to thank you for your time and attention. Forgive me for butchering the pronunciation of the aforementioned great writers of such an important era of our history. It is likely that this slight has occurred due to the fact that I am not too good at speaking in English or life in general. Goodbye.